Hey guys, today's story is a little different. It's not about someone getting stabbed in the back at work or left out in the cold by a business partner. No, this one cuts deeper. This one is about family, the kind of betrayal that doesn't make headlines but lives in your skin. The kind that disguises itself as tradition and wears civility like a mask. And if you think karma's slow, wait until you hear this. My name is Lisa Langdon. I'm 37 years old, a school counselor in Asheville, North Carolina. I spend my days listening to young voices navigating pain, confusion, identity, things I know a little too well. What they don't know is that I sit in that chair every day holding stories I never got to tell, wearing scars no one thought to acknowledge. And maybe that's why I became who I am, to help others find their way out of shadows like the one I was born into. So, before you get pulled in, take a second to like this video and subscribe, but only if you actually believe that betrayal always comes back around. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if someone in your life ever made you feel like you were born to play second fiddle. Now sit back, let the room go quiet, and let me tell you how it really went down. Growing up in the Langdon household was like starring in a play where the script was already written and I was cast as the disappointment. My older brother Jonathan was the golden boy, top of his class, quarterback, accepted into Ivy League schools before he could legally vote. My parents, especially my father, held him up like some living emblem of the family name. Every conversation, every holiday, every whispered legacy at the dinner table was about him. Jonathan will lead this family into the future, they'd say. Elisa has a creative spirit, they'd add as a footnote, like I was some soft blur in the margins of their legacy. When I made the dean's list at UNC Chapel Hill, my mother called it cute. When Jonathan scored an internship at a law firm, we threw a backyard party. I remember standing in the kitchen, icing a cake I baked myself because no one else thought to, and thinking, maybe if I stay small enough, quiet enough, they'll see me. Maybe I'll earn my place at the table, not just as the family therapist, but as a daughter worth claiming. But nothing I did ever tilted the scale. Jonathan got a job at a corporate law firm in Charlotte. I started counseling teens struggling with anxiety, broken homes, bullying. I poured everything I had into my work. It didn't matter. To them, it was still Jonathan's world. I was just visiting. Last year, at Thanksgiving, it finally shattered. Dinner was the usual performance: roast turkey no one liked, forced laughter over undercooked stuffing, and my father at the head of the table like a monarch auditioning for sainthood. Jonathan, as always, sat to his right. I was across from them, alone. My mother asked Jonathan about his new promotion, and he launched into a monologue about mergers and acquisitions like he was on CNBC. Everyone clapped. My father raised a glass and said, "Jonathan, you've made this family proud. You carry the Langdon name with dignity. Every family has its complications, of course." He turned to me, smiling like it was affection, and added, "But Elisa, you've shown resilience in your own quirky way." Quirky. Complication. Resilience. It was a eulogy, not a compliment. A condescending tribute to someone they decided didn't matter. The words hit me like ice water. I laughed because I'd learned that was safer than crying, but that night, I couldn't sleep. I laid in bed replaying every slight, every omission, every gathering I wasn't invited to or was forgotten in. And I kept hearing it on loop: every family has a complication. What if I wasn't the complication? What if I was the consequence? That thought kept me awake. And as the sun rose, another memory broke through: my grandmother. My dad's mother. She passed when I was 24, but we'd always had a quiet bond. She saw me in ways the rest didn't. When I was 12, I remember her whispering, "There are things people bury for so long, they forget where the shovel is." I didn't understand it then. I do now. She used to keep journals. Leather-bound, always labeled, lined in her slanted cursive. After her death, my parents boxed up her belongings and stored them in the attic. No one touched them again. Until now. I told my mother I'd left a jacket at their house and asked if I could stop by the next day. She was annoyed but agreed. They weren't home when I arrived. I had a key. I went straight upstairs, past the guest room, up to the attic door. I hadn't been up there in over a decade. The air was musty. Boxes stacked like tombstones. And there, in the back, under a blanket, I found the box, Personal M. Langdon. I opened it slowly. Inside were 6 journals, 2 albums, and a small yellow envelope. On the front, in her delicate hand, for Elisa. When you're ready. I sat on the floor. Opened the flap. Inside, a note, the past is never buried. It only waits. Protect your heart, but don't look away. And taped beneath it, a DNA test kit. Unused. Clean. Untouched. I didn't understand. But something in my chest cracked open. My breath grew shallow. Why would she leave this for me? I wasn't sure yet. But I knew one thing for certain, I was done being their afterthought. I was going to find out why I was always treated like a ghost in a family that couldn't bear to look me in the eye. The days that followed were filled with a kind of stillness that didn't feel like peace. It was more like the pause between lightning and thunder. I kept that DNA kit in my nightstand drawer, unopened, yet pulsing with implication every time I reached for a pair of socks. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for, but I knew I couldn't look away anymore. I kept hearing her words me grandmother over and over again, protect your heart, but don't look away. She hadn't just meant pain. She meant power. And I wasn't going to waste either. I began by retracing what I did know. My birth certificate listed my father as Gregory Langdon. I was born 2 years after Jonathan, in the same hospital, delivered by the same doctor. But that didn't mean much. What struck me as strange now were all the moments I'd overheard growing up that never made sense until now. Like the way my father once told my mother, we agreed never to dig that up again, after she came home from lunch with an old friend. Or how my aunt once drunkenly called me the surprise that kept surprising. I started asking quiet questions. I met with a family friend who used to be our neighbor when I was a baby. Her name was Mrs. Carver, a widow in her 70s who remembered everything, especially gossip. We sat on her porch with sweet tea, and when I asked her about the time around my birth, she blinked slowly. Your mama was glowing, I remember that. But your daddy, well, I don't mean no offense, looked like he was walking through fog. Some days, it was like he forgot you even existed. I felt the blood drain from my face. Did they ever say anything? Like maybe I wasn't planned? She tapped her glass. Sugar, in this town, everyone was either planned, prayed for, or a problem. The real stories never get told. I thanked her and drove straight home, barely remembering the route. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, the test kit finally unwrapped before me. I swabbed my cheek like the instructions said, sealed it, labeled it, and dropped it off the next morning at a testing center that specialized in familial analysis. No fanfare. No drama. Just a quiet act of defiance. Waiting was a different kind of torture. For the next 2 weeks, I went through the motions of work, smiling at students, nodding at meetings while my thoughts spiraled through 100 possible truths. What if I wasn't his daughter? What if my mother had lied? What if the whole reason I was treated like a problem was because I wasn't a product of their picture-perfect life but a reminder of something shameful? When the results came back, I opened them alone. No wine. No soundtrack. Just silence. And just like that, the foundation cracked. The report didn't match. Gregory Langdon, my legal father, was not my biological parent. The results were definitive, over 99.99% accuracy. My biological father was listed as unavailable, with a note indicating the potential for unknown paternal lineage. I sat still for a long time. Not crying. Not shaking. Just still. Like my body knew this truth all along, but my mind had finally caught up. I wasn't angry at first. I wasn't anything. It was like watching the ending of a movie I'd already seen in a dream. What I did feel was vindicated. This was the truth. This was why I never fit. Why I was always treated like a rental in a house of airs. Why my grandmother, bless her, had tried to give me a key to a door everyone else kept bolting shut. The next step wasn't rage. It was precision. I made copies. Clean ones. One to keep. One to give. One to protect. I placed the original in a lockbox at my bank. The second, I kept in my purse. The third? That one I put in a white envelope, the kind people use for wedding invites. I sealed it and wrote in delicate cursive, just like hers, for Gregory. When you're ready. But I didn't mail it. Not yet. Because there was one more step left. See, Jonathan had been planning an extravagant 70th birthday party for our father. A black tie event at a rented ballroom, with live jazz and custom monogrammed dinnerware. I wasn't invited, at least not officially. But I heard about it through my cousin Melissa, who always had a soft spot for me and no filter for secrets. He said, "It's not really your scene," she whispered on the phone, voice full of guilt. Said it might be awkward. You know, with the speeches and the donors. Of course. I was the awkward one. The problem child. The silent complication they'd rather hide. I thanked her and hung up. I didn't argue. I didn't ask why. But I knew one thing. I'd be there. And I wouldn't be empty-handed. The week leading up to the birthday gala, I moved through my days with an eerie sense of clarity. I showed up to work with more calm than usual, prepared my lessons, laughed gently with the students, and even managed to meet a few deadlines ahead of time. But underneath that smooth surface, something was sharpening. A focus I hadn't known I was capable of. I wasn't spiraling or seeking sympathy. I was preparing for something final, like drawing in a deep, measured breath before setting fire to a paper house. On the morning of the party, I slipped into a deep green dress, not flashy, but commanding. It wasn't the kind of outfit my family associated with me. It was structured, elegant, purposeful. Like armor. I'd made a last-minute call to Melissa the night before to ask what time people were arriving. She hesitated for half a second, but gave me the details. 7 sharp. The Langdon men didn't believe in late entrances, only grand ones. The event was at the Belridge Hotel Ballroom, a place reserved for fundraisers and political campaigns. Jonathan must have spent a fortune. A jazz trio warmed up on the stage as I walked in unannounced, weaving through small talk and crystal glass clinks. No one stopped me. No one questioned me. I was invisible, as always. And that invisibility was my power now. The room shimmered with warm golden light bouncing off champagne flutes. My father stood near the center, hands clasped behind his back like a statesman. Jonathan was at his side, dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than my car. He was shaking hands with a local councilman, all smiles, all pride. I waited. At exactly 7:45, Jonathan called for attention. A silver fork on a wine glass. That old trick. The room dimmed slightly as the jazz band quieted. He raised his glass and began a speech I'd heard 100 variations of before about legacy, discipline, the Langdon name, all the same notes sung over polished silver. And no man embodies integrity and leadership like my father, he said. We are honored to celebrate this milestone, his 70th, with all of you, friends, family, and partners who've made this journey so rich. Polite applause. Glowing smiles. My mother dabbing the corners of her eyes like she was auditioning for Best Supporting Matriarch. That's when I stepped forward. I walked slowly, not rushing, not theatrical. Just steady. Purposeful. The envelope in my hand felt heavier than paper. It felt like a lifetime. There was a moment, just one, when Jonathan saw me. His smile faltered. He blinked, confused, then quickly masked it with a nod. But I could tell hadn't expected me here. My father turned slightly, wine glass in hand, brows furrowed. I didn't think you'd, he began. I held up the envelope. Happy birthday, Dad, I said, loud enough for the microphone to catch. This is for you. I handed it to him and turned away before he could speak. I didn't wait for him to open it. I didn't need to. As I walked back through the stunned crowd, I caught my mother's face. Pale. Blank. As if she were staring at a ghost she thought was long buried. I passed Melissa. She reached out, brushing my arm, her eyes wide with a question she couldn't voice. I didn't stop walking. Behind me, the murmurs grew. A few people called after me. I didn't look back. I stepped outside into the cool night, the sound of jazz muffled by the heavy ballroom doors. The air hit me like clarity. Clean. Free. In that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Weightless. Not because I'd finally told the truth, but because I didn't need to carry their version of it anymore. I wasn't there to destroy them. I was there to free myself. Let the truth do what it always does, unravel in silence, one stunned room at a time. The morning after the birthday party, I did something radical. I turned off my phone. I didn't want to see the fallout, not yet. Not the predictable messages, the carefully worded, concerned texts, or the thinly veiled guilt trips disguised as family duty. Instead, I brewed a slow cup of coffee, cracked open a window, and let the cool morning air flood the room. For once, the silence didn't feel like isolation. It felt like ownership. It felt like peace. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't owe anyone a response, not an explanation, not a justification, not even an apology. Of course, by noon, they came anyway. Melissa was the first. What was that? What did you hand him? Then my mother, you've humiliated your father. For what? And predictably, Jonathan, the crown prince, whatever grudge you've held on to, that wasn't the time or place. I read them all briefly, like someone glancing at old headlines in a paper they'd already thrown away. But I didn't reply. Not out of pettiness, but because I knew that no combination of words could change what had already been said. Or more importantly, what had been proven. You see, my whole life I'd been told to keep things quiet. To not make a scene. To respect the family name. And I had followed that rule like scripture. I kept my voice soft, my presence small. But what none of them ever realized was that silence doesn't mean surrender. Sometimes silence is a loaded chamber. Sometimes, it's just waiting for the right moment to fire. That weekend, I packed a bag and drove 3 hours up into the mountains. I had rented a small cabin, Wi-Fi, no cell signal, no excuses to be interrupted. I needed a break, not just from them, but from the noise of my own mind. The kind that echoes with memories you thought were buried. In that quiet, I opened the final journal my grandmother had left behind. The one I'd been too afraid to read fully until now. It felt like she was still guiding me, still protecting me from truths I wasn't ready to carry before. Toward the back was a folded letter. My name was written on the outside in her old, careful handwriting. The kind I used to trace with my finger as a child. Inside, the words were simple but devastating. Elisa, if you're reading this, the secret is no longer a secret. I always hoped you'd find it, in your own time, with strength I know you carry. She went on to explain what I had only started to suspect: the separation, the affair, the man named Thomas, and how the truth had been buried under decades of denial. Your mother was scared, she wrote, and Gregory. He chose silence over confrontation. But it was never fair to you. As I read, my hands trembled, not from shock, but from validation. From the violent confirmation that the distance I'd always felt, the outsider status I'd internalized, wasn't imagined. It was inherited. Engineered. The foundation of our family had been laid on shame and cowardice. And I had spent decades absorbing the fallout. But that letter did something else. It set me free. Suddenly, the narrative they'd tried to feed me no longer applied. I wasn't a mistake. I wasn't a problem. I was a product of truth they couldn't face. And now, they would have to. When I returned home, I went straight to the courthouse and filed for a legal name change. I wasn't doing it out of rebellion, I was doing it out of reclamation. I chose Ellis. My grandmother's maiden name. A name untainted by lies, unburdened by legacy. Elisa Ellis. It sounded honest. Like someone I could finally believe in. A few days later, the local paper ran a piece that changed everything. Disruption at dignitary's party raises questions about family legacy. It was tactful, vague, but the implication was clear. Rumors spread like wildfire. I wasn't the one talking, but others were. A woman who'd been a guest at the party told her book club. A former church secretary dropped a comment in a Facebook group. A family friend leaked that something personal had come out about the Langdon sand. It wasn't flattering. And just like that, their perfect image began to crumble. Slowly. Quietly. But unmistakably. Jonathan stopped posting on LinkedIn. My father was under the weather and canceled 3 golf outings. My mother, who used to send out quarterly family updates to everyone from the church elders to her hairdresser, went completely silent. I wasn't gleeful about it. That's the part most people misunderstand. Revenge, when it's real, isn't about gloating. It's about restoring balance. And balance doesn't scream. It whispers. It sits in the stillness of knowing you were never the broken one. What I felt wasn't pride. It was peace. It wasn't until the second week after the party that the phone call came, not from my father, or Jonathan, or even my mother. It was from a name I didn't recognize at first. A journalist from a national features desk. Apparently, someone had forwarded the local paper's vague headline, and a producer found the family name interesting enough to pitch the story to their editorial board. "I just wanted to know if you'd be open to telling your side," she said gently. "There's power in clarity. Especially for women who've been silenced." I declined. Not because I was afraid of the story getting out, but because I wasn't sure I wanted it weaponized by strangers. This wasn't entertainment. This wasn't content. This was my life. And after decades of it being warped and buried by other people's egos, I wasn't ready to let it slip away into someone else's hands again. But her call did remind me, I had control now. Full control. And with that came a responsibility not to punish them, but to protect myself. That protection started with truth, but it didn't end there. So I did the thing none of them ever thought I would. I sat down, opened a blank document, and began to write a letter not to them, but to myself. A written testimony of who I was. Who I had become. What I had overcome. It wasn't a letter full of rage. It was calm. Clear. Cold in its precision. It listed what had been said over the years, what had been withheld, and what had been done to me under the guise of family loyalty. And then, paragraph by paragraph, I dismantled their narrative. When I finished, I printed a copy and placed it into the same lockbox where I now kept my name change papers, the DNA results, and my grandmother's last letter. That box was more than a vault. It was a grave. For the version of me they'd tried to define. Around that time, I received an invitation, formal, embossed, from Jonathan and Melissa. A baby shower. It was addressed to Elisa Langdon. They hadn't gotten the memo. Or maybe they had, and this was their way of erasing the wound, brushing it under a banner of future joy. I tossed it into the recycling bin without even opening it. Because here's what they still didn't understand. Forgiveness doesn't mean returning to the scene of the crime. Sometimes, it means walking so far away from the fire that the smoke can't reach you anymore. I kept my distance. Quietly. Intentionally. But others didn't. People I hadn't heard from in years reached out with soft, almost reverent messages. I always felt like you were treated unfairly. Your grandmother would be proud. It's about time someone stood up. The words warmed me, but they didn't inflate me. Because I wasn't interested in becoming some accidental hero. I didn't need applause. What I had needed all those years was the space to breathe without being blamed for the cracks in someone else's foundation. A few months later, I learned from a friend at the town records office that my father had applied for a passport renewal and been flagged for verification due to conflicting legal guardianship dates on my birth certificate. Apparently, one system update had required a secondary confirmation of paternity, and when they scanned the updated records, the timeline didn't match. Bureaucracy has a funny way of catching up with buried secrets. It wasn't a scandal, at least not publicly. But it caused enough of a ripple that he had to visit the office in person to clarify some discrepancies. I imagine that was an awkward conversation. A man whose entire identity rested on appearances suddenly facing paperwork that refused to lie for him. That was the quiet power of truth. It didn't shout. It didn't knock over tables. It just showed up in unexpected places, refusing to disappear. And yet, through it all, I felt no desire to retaliate further. I didn't want to shame them. I didn't want them ruined. I simply wanted them to sit with what they had done, not because I told them to, but because life would inevitably make them. That, I've learned, is the ultimate reversal. Not revenge. Revelation. Not fireworks, but floodlights. Let them explain why their daughter walked away and never returned. Let them answer the questions with dry throats and trembling hands. Let their own silence echo louder than anything I could ever say. I was done speaking. Because I no longer needed to be heard by people who'd spent decades plugging their ears. It was a Saturday morning when I finally returned to the cemetery where my grandmother was buried. The gravel crunched under my shoes like a quiet reminder of every step it took to reach this moment. I hadn't been back since the funeral. Not because I didn't care, but because for the longest time, I didn't feel worthy of standing at her grave. I had carried around that old wound, the one that whispers maybe they were right about you, maybe you really were the mistake. But now, standing there, with the truth behind me and silence ahead, I finally understood, I was never the mistake. I was the unacknowledged truth. And that was never my shame to carry. I knelt by her headstone and ran my fingers across the etched letters like they were sacred scripture. You were right, I whispered. They couldn't hold it together. But I did. I made it through. I didn't cry. Not out of strength, but because I had already shed the version of myself that needed their permission to feel grief. What I felt now wasn't sadness, it was liberation. A kind of internal stillness that comes when you finally accept you were never broken, just silenced. Afterward, I took the long way home through the part of town I used to avoid. Too many memories. Too many shadows. I passed the old bakery where Jonathan and I used to go after Sunday school. I used to think that cinnamon rolls could solve anything. The bakery was still there, windows foggy, a chalkboard sign outside advertising fresh peach turnovers. I almost walked in. Almost. But instead, I just stood across the street and watched a young mother and her daughter come out, laughing, their hands sticky with sugar. That used to be us. Before legacy got in the way. That night, I lit a candle and opened my journal, something I hadn't done in months. Not because I had nothing to write, but because so much had finally been said. Still, I needed to mark this moment. The end of the beginning. I wrote, today I stood where silence used to own me. And I didn't flinch. That sentence was my closure. Not fireworks. Not confrontation. Just that simple declaration that I was still here and more myself than ever. In the following weeks, I received the occasional message. A distant cousin wanting to hear my side. A church friend asking if it was really true. I answered none of them. Not out of spite, but because I was done clarifying my existence. People will always rewrite stories to protect their own comfort. I just no longer felt responsible for correcting their fiction. And then came the moment I hadn't expected. A handwritten letter in the mailbox. No return address. Just my name, Elisa Ellis. Inside was a folded sheet, neatly written in my father's unmistakable cursive. It said, "I didn't know how to love what I didn't understand. I hope someday, that can be enough." I sat with that letter for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I simply folded it back, slid it into my drawer, and left it there like an artifact. A small, dented piece of an empire that once ruled my life. I didn't write back. There was nothing left to say. Words can't fix the damage that silence cemented over decades. And real forgiveness isn't always loud or symmetrical. Sometimes it's just this, not letting bitterness dictate your next breath. I've moved again. Somewhere coastal this time. A little rental cottage with chipped paint, creaky floors, and the kind of morning light that makes everything feel like possibility. Here, no one knows me as the disgrace. I'm just Elisa. A woman who teaches writing workshops, tends to her herb garden, and sometimes stares at the sea as if it might give her back time that was stolen. It won't, of course. But that's not the sea's job. That's mine. The last entry in my journal reads, "They wanted a daughter who would keep the family name clean." What they got was a woman who made her own name mean something. That sentence? That's the closest thing to peace I've ever written. And if they ever tell the story differently, and I'm sure they really won't argue. Because the truth doesn't need defending when you've already lived it. Some endings don't arrive with applause or answers. They come quietly, like the sound of a door closing behind you, not in anger, but in finality. That's what this is. Not a victory march. Not revenge soaked in drama. Just a woman, standing in the remains of what was once her story, finally holding the pen. When people ask me now if I regret any of it, the silence, the exposure, the unraveling of a family built on image, I tell them no. Not because it didn't hurt. But because truth, even when it burns, is cleaner than any lie. You can build from truth. You can't build from rot. I've stopped trying to make sense of why they did what they did. Sometimes people hurt you not because you're weak, but because your strength reveals their own fractures. I threatened the myth they had wrapped themselves in. I was the reminder that legacy without integrity is just a well-dressed lie. And yet, I didn't set out to destroy them. All I ever wanted was a place at the table. A moment where someone looked at me and said, "You belong here." I gave up on that seat. Not because I wasn't worthy, but because I finally realized I could build my own table somewhere better, quieter, warmer. So if you're watching this, and you've been made to feel like the disappointment, the outsider, the afterthought, hear this. You don't need their acceptance to validate your truth. You don't need their approval to be free. Walk away if you have to. Speak up if you're ready. Either way, make sure the story you live is one you would be proud to tell, even if no one claps when it ends.